So we've seen how the Popular Front government tried to tackle the economic crisis in France in the mid-1930s, albeit with not much success. What about its efforts to promote a new awareness, a new tolerance towards the French Empire? Obviously, with the Socialist Party leading the Popular Front, the Socialist Party had traditionally been anti-colonial, and Leon Blum tried to introduce policies that, I guess, more moderate policies towards the French Empire. So the map you're looking at on the screen here is the division of the old Ottoman Empire in the Middle East at the end of the First World War, where the French and the British carved up the Ottoman Empire itself. France was given control of what is now Syria and Lebanon. And under Leon Blum, the French government decided in 1936 to introduce, or essentially to give Syria and Lebanon their independence. And this was a way of the socialist government trying to cast off some vestiges of empire. And the idea wasn't popular. What was the attitude of the average deputy in the French Parliament? So the Parliament refused to ratify the treaty that Blum made granting independence to Syria and Lebanon, and they were to remain part of the French Empire until the end of the Second World War. The place that the Popular Front government was most concerned about, that most wanted to try and reform aspects of colonial rule, was of course in Algeria. And Algeria, as we'll see going forward, is going to be a constant dilemma for every French government from now until the 1960s about how to reconcile the fact that Algeria, in theory, is a regular part of France, no different from any other part of France, but in practice is governed like a colony, in that the majority Muslim population have no say in the French government. So what Blum was hoping to do was to introduce a series of reforms that would allow Algerian Muslims who had been educated in the French education system, who were known as the Évolués, that is the quote-unquote evolved, who were kind of more French in their outlook, to have some say in government, not just to be able to vote in elections, as the white European population was in Algeria, but actually to be allowed to acquire government jobs. And the reason Blum felt this was important was he was aware there was a growing movement in Algeria towards various radical nationalist movements. So the Party of the People of Algeria was established in the early 1920s, was starting to grow more, gain more followers. Similarly, there were a variety of Muslim militant groups in Algeria that essentially were calling for a form of holy war against the French, to drive the French out of Algeria. So a variety of different forces that were increasingly growing hostile to the French presence in Algeria. An important leader for the Algerians was a guy called Ferhat Abbas. He was one of the Évolués, that is one of the French educated Algerians from a Muslim background. He was one of the people whom Blum had in mind when he was talking about these reforms, in terms of trying to allow Évolués like Abbas to vote in elections, to allow them to be eligible for government positions, with the hope that if they could reconcile this educated elite amongst the indigenous Algerian population, this would help. These elites basically would help control or I'm trying to think the exact way of phrasing it, to stifle the kind of growing unrest in Algeria regarding French rule. And of course, so these were relatively moderate proposals. What was the attitude of the average member of parliament back in France? Essentially, there was outrage. In fact, there was so much outrage that Blum's government never even bothered introducing the measures into the French Deputy of Chambers, because they were quite aware that there was very, very bitter, hostile opposition. And in the long run, this was detrimental to French rule of Algeria, that it certainly helped parties like the Algerian People's Party in reinforcing their message that the French government simply was a colonial tyrant. And it also convinced the kind of more moderates like Abbas that the French never were going to follow through on their promise of full assimilation for the Algerian people into France, and that therefore some form of separatist movement might be necessary. So Blum attempts to reform French rule in Algeria as well as the Middle East, but was ultimately stifled in trying to do so. Of course, the biggest international controversy for the Popular Front government came to the south. So here's our question here. This Spanish general led the opposition to the Republican government during the Spanish Civil War. You should know who is Francisco Franco. So the Spanish Civil War breaks out in 1936. And as a war, as a conflict, it obviously attracted attention all across Europe as it pitted left-wing and right-wing forces in armed conflict with one another. One of the most famous artistic expressions was Pablo Picasso's painting Guernica, reflecting the horror of not just the Spanish War in general, but also the armed bombing of the Basque town of Guernica during the war. The reason the Spanish Civil War was of particular interest to the French Popular Front government, aside from the fact that Spain was obviously a neighbour, was the fact that the Spanish government was left-leaning, was also a Popular Front government, a coalition of various left forces who had taken power in the mid-1930s. And no other issue served to kind of widen the tensions between the three elements of the Popular Front government, that is the Communist Party, the Socialist Party, and the Radical Republican Party, than the Spanish Civil War. Blum himself favoured intervention, that he felt something should be done to protect the democratically elected left-wing government of Spain. But he was faced with a number of opponents within the Socialist Party who had traditionally been very strong advocates of pacifism and felt it wasn't the place of the French state to get involved in military conflicts. The Radical Republicans, on the one hand, really weren't interested in getting involved in the conflict at all. They considered the French or the Spanish popular government to be far more left-leaning than the French version, far more communist than the French version, and therefore felt it was not France's place to get involved in that conflict. And perhaps not surprisingly, on the other side of the spectrum, the Communist Party of France was very sympathetic to the Popular Front government of Spain, wanted to take active military intervention, of course was doing so on orders from the Soviet Union, which was a strong supporter, which did supply weapons and advice to the Popular Front government in Spain. The Communist Party pushed for open French intervention into Spain as well. In the end, Blum decided to support a policy of non-intervention, but that really kind of served to, I suppose in some ways, ultimately was the undoing of the Popular Front government and starting to widen its divisions. Indeed, Blum himself resigned as Prime Minister of the Popular Front government, so unhappy were people at his position in June 1937. So he himself was only Prime Minister for 1 year. What's interesting in this time period, especially with the tensions generated by the Spanish Civil War, is that there was also a surge of anti-Semitism in France itself. One reason was obviously in Nazi Germany, with educated Jews fleeing Germany, many of them coming to France, and many of them not just poor immigrants from Eastern Europe as Jews had been in the early 20th century, but well-educated doctors, lawyers, professors, etc. And of course, in coming to France, they suddenly provided competition, economic competition, for French lawyers, doctors, other professional positions. And this seems to fuel French anti-Semitism. So I know this, well, most you can't read French anyway, and this graphic isn't very clear, but the poster is saying, French people, beware of the wily Jew and his efforts to kind of promote the black market. Don't have any doing with him. It's his fault, essentially, of their rations, because the Jews are responsible for all the shortcomings in France. So this was just one example of growing anti-Semitism in France itself. Interestingly, the French government actually passed a law in order to try and stifle racial discrimination and anti-Semitism in 1939, but the growing hostility towards Jews in the late 1930s was to prove particularly dangerous for Jews in 1940 once the Germans invaded and took control of France. One of the best examples of the manifestation of right-wing forces in France in the late 1960s was a group called La Cagoule, that were the Hooded Ones. Their official name was the organization of the Committee of the Secret Armed Revolution, who were promoting essentially the overthrow of the Popular Front government and its replacement with a right-wing dictatorship. And let's figure out who was involved in this. So Eugene Paul-Louis Schuller established this, the world's largest cosmetic company, in 1919. And is what is L'Oreal? So what's that got to do with La Cagoule? Well, Schuler was the one who was actually funding La Cagoule, and they were essentially engaged in. So here's L'Oreal, proud sponsors of right-wing terrorists in France in the 1930s. So La Cagoule essentially was the reason they were called La Cagoule, the hooded ones, was that they kind of wore these costumes or these outfits almost like the Ku Klux Klan, or at least the words were in their kind of secret meetings. They adopted these kind of almost hooded ornaments to kind of maintain a level of secrecy. They murdered various figures associated with the political left, and were part of the kind of anti-Popular Front government or the anti-Popular Front movement of France in the late 1930s, and it just shows you the kind of rising kind of bitterness and tension within French society. The French government eventually was able to kind of suppress La Cagoule and arrest most of its prominent members, but there were other groups. We talked about Colonel de la Roque and his Croix de Fouet group in the early 1930s. They reformed as the Parti Social Français, the French Social Party, but were modelled essentially on National Socialism. So there really was an upsurge of right-wing forces, some of them anti-democratic right-wing forces, in the face of the rise of the Popular Front government. The Popular Front government itself eventually fell in 1938, or to be more specific, when we say it fell, it was replaced that essentially the Socialist Party was no longer able to form a ministry, and it was left to the Radical Republicans, led by Edouard Daladier, who we've seen earlier on, who was going to be Prime Minister of France at a moment of deep crisis in its history, to take charge instead. Daladier firstly tried to, in order to kickstart the French economy, overthrew the law of 1836, or the Matignon Accord, that brought in the 40-hour week. He outlawed that, or he reversed that. That produced a series of strikes, which he was very willing to use kind of police suppression to stifle the strikes, but to some extent was actually quite successful in terms of faced off the strikers, managed to force them to go back to work, and there was a genuine increase in French industrial output in 1939, to mark as the French state essentially was starting to gear up for war. So Daladier, on the one hand, is trying to maintain the stability of the French economy and pacify the French domestic scene, while of course in the background dealing with the growing danger of war with Germany, which we'll talk about in our next class. So the Popular Front government, ultimately it fell. I mean, despite the high hopes that its various supporters had, it would prove to be unsustainable. It didn't have an enormous amount of success, and of course one reason for this was the changing and very, very chaotic international scene in the late 1930s. One of the best kind of demonstrations of that chaos itself. So in 1937, France held a World Trade Exhibition in Paris, and where various countries put on kind of displays of their industrial offerings. And what was quite notable was that both the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany created these very, very elaborate pavilions as a way of demonstrating their kind of political and economic and industrial might, and the fact that these two pavilions were kind of facing one another, in many ways foreshadowed the growing conflict that was to come in Germany, in Europe in the late 1930s, early 1940s, in the Second World War. So, in long story short, the Popular government was not particularly successful. Its efforts to introduce economic reforms had minimal success, and in some ways kind of hindered the French economy. It was unable to prevent the rise of fascism across Europe, although, as we'll see in our next class, that was not something unique to the Popular Front government. But it did have some measure of success in terms of creating a greater collective awareness amongst the French working class of the potential that when they unite and put aside their kind of various ideological differences, that they had the capacity to take power, and perhaps in more fortuitous settings, would be able to introduce real social reform in France.